Just a few months ago, the judicial reform plan of Israeli government sparked a large-scale protest there. Hundreds of thousands of people went on streets, putting enormous political pressure on the government. On March 26, the Israeli defense minister openly opposed the reform, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, dismissed him from the position, triggering larger opposition. The next day, Netanyahu announced the suspension of the judicial reform plan, making a little bit semblance of stability to the government. During this period, there emerged a voice claiming American interference in Israeli internal affairs through a color revolution. But certainly, this news has problems. Firstly, it originated from Yair Netanyahu, the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, who retweeted a post by a so-called foreign affairs expert saying like the US State Department was founding a color revolution against his father. However, the source of this claim can be traced back to a far-right US media named the Washington Free Beacon. Their main characteristics is their dislike for the Democratic Party, and their tendency is to create sensational headlines to attack democratic policies. Okay, so we can just ignore this ridiculous fake news, but there's something bigger behind this reform, and that is the right-wing shift in Israel's society. So yes, Israel is right-wing now, and to understand this change, we need to start from Israel's judicial reform this year. In fact, through this reform, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu aimed to limit the power of Supreme Court and expand the authority of the parliament. The underlying reason behind is the right-wing forces in Israel currently dominate over the left wing, and the right-wing leaders have become strong enough to attempt to break free from constraints and get bigger power to change Israel's foreign policy in the future. This will also have a huge impact on the Middle East region. Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Max, and today I will discuss Israel's judicial reform and right-wing tendency. To understand this reform, firstly, we gotta know Israel's political system. Israel is a parliamentary democracy where the president holds no real power and the prime minister relies on the majority support of a 120-member parliament to govern. Secondly, the Israeli parliament has never had a stable two-party system like the United States, with political parties having highly different ideologies and political beliefs. The Likud party, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, is currently the largest party with only 32 seats. When Netanyahu first came to power, the Likud party only had 27 seats. Therefore, it is necessary for multiple parties to form coalitions. This coalition situation is somewhat similar to the government formation process in Germany last year, and as a result, their internal policy debates are often intense. Previously, Netanyahu had briefly held office in the parliament, but he was forced to step down. Later, came back again and eventually hold on for an extended period. However, the Likud party's grip on power is not solid, and Netanyahu himself lacks sufficient credibility within the party to achieve long-term stability and advancing policies. In 2021, a coalition of 8 left-wing and right-wing parties united to challenge Netanyahu, and Naftali Bennett from the right-wing Yamin party became the prime minister. Although Likud party still remains the largest party in the parliament, the anti-Netanyahu allies spans left, center, and right-wing factions. However, apart from their dislike for Netanyahu, this ally lacks of a common ideology, and their unite are primarily driven by the exchange of their interests. Therefore, this ally did not last very long. After a year and a half, several parties withdrew the support for the cabinet, making Bennett step down. In November 2022, Israel held another general election, and the Likud party once again won the most seats, bringing Netanyahu back. This time, he managed to rally several new allies and secure the support of 64 seats to form a new government. The Likud party is a right-wing leaning faction that had conflicts with its former right-wing allies. Therefore, they sort of collaborated with the far-right allies. These new allies included religious Jewish parties such as the Jewish Home, Shas, Jewish Power, and the Union of Religious Zionism. I feel like you can easily tell who they are from the names. It can be seen that Netanyahu's current coalition has formed the most conservative cabinet in Israeli history, and they are much stronger than before, which led to the subsequent judicial reform. Before the introduction of the judicial reform plan, the Minister of Internal Security was Itamar Ben-Gvir, the leader of the Jewish Power Party. As a crazy Jewish nationalist, he was so radical in his early years that he was even accepted from a military service by the Israeli Defense Forces, which is quite rare for a country where military service is highly valued. Ben-Gvir has consistently been claiming that Israel is not an ordinary secular state, but exclusively belongs to the Jewish people and Judaism, strongly opposing making any concessions to the Arab country. Just in a month as the Minister of Internal Security, on January 3, 2023, Ben-Gvir, accompanied by the police, entered the Temple Mount in the Old City of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount is a holy site for both Judaism and Islam, and has long been a focal point of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel gained control of the Old City of Jerusalem from Jordan. Then, agreement was reached, granting control of the Temple Mount to Jordan and Muslims, while Israel's police maintained security control. So, Ben-Gvir's entry into the Temple Mount area clearly undermined previous political compromises and understandings, hugely exacerbating the conflict and problem. Even Israeli politicians criticize him for making his personal political interests at the expense of the entire country. Actually, this action is not the first case in Israel. In September 2000, former Israeli Prime Minister Sharon forcibly visited the Temple Mount, causing large-scale Israeli-Palestinian conflicts that ultimately resulted in the death of thousands. Ben-Gvir's recent visit to the Temple Mount is clearly imitating his predecessor and expressing a firm determination to defend Israel's religious interests. As a cabinet minister displaying such a radical attitude, we don't know if it was a deliberate arrangement by the Netanyahu government, but this action has given the right-wing allies bigger confidence. They are considering if they can utilize the most powerful right-wing allies in this country's history to weaken the power of Supreme Court and prepare for the future political reforms. Now, let's briefly introduce Israel's power structure. Israel implements a separation of powers. However, the legislative branch, responsible for lawmaking, is a unicameral parliament without the checks or imbalance of the upper and lower house. That's why Netanyahu can control the executive and the legislative branches at the same time. In terms of the judiciary, Israel does not have a written constitution but relies on the series of basic laws that serves as a constitutional rule. The Supreme Court is almost the only institution capable of checking the parliament. For example, in February 2017, the Israeli parliament passed a law mandating the expropriation of some private Palestinian land. In 2020, the Supreme Court of Israel, with 8 votes in favor and 1 vote against, repealed this law, stating that it violated the property rights and equality of the Palestinians. The Supreme Court has also repeatedly overturned administrative decisions of Netanyahu's cabinet regarding restrictions on minority voting rights and racial segregation. Therefore, many right-wing individuals have always been disliking Israel's Supreme Court. Furthermore, during his long period in power, Netanyahu himself has been involved in many corruption scandals, some of which are still under trial, creating political and public pressure. Netanyahu's allies have also faced similar issues. For example, Minister of Health Aryeh Deri, who is also the leader of the religious party Shas, served as the Minister of Internal Affairs in 2000 and was convicted of bribery, resulting in charges of moral turpitude and a 3-year prison sentence. In January 2022, Deri was sentenced to 12 months of imprisonment with a suspended sentence for tax issues. On January 18, 2023, the Supreme Court ruled that Deri had a criminal record and was not suitable for the cabinet. Netanyahu had no choice but to dismiss Duri from his position. If the Supreme Court's power can be weakened through reforms, it will somewhat relieve the pressure of political scandals. Next, let's look at Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial reform plan. First, using personnel power to control the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court will be expanded from 9 to 11 judges, with the 2 additional judges nominated by the current government. This move really reminds me of their good friend, former US President Donald Trump. Second, using legislative power to suppress judicial power. The parliament will be allowed to override the Supreme Court's decisions with a simple majority vote, and the Supreme Court will not have the power to overturn a law passed by the parliament. Finally, the Supreme Court will not have the final decision-making authority. With the majority seats in the ruling coalition, the Israeli parliament passed the first bill of judicial reform plan on February 21st this year. However, at this moment, the Israeli public and media have already noticed this dangerous signal. Israeli people are concerned about Netanyahu's personal power expansion, which could turn a parliamentary democracy into authoritarian ruling, and expand the political ideology of the right-wing allies throughout the whole country. Public opinion polls shows that over 65% of the population supports maintaining the existing powers of the Supreme Court and are against this reform. While there are public protests, there are also voices of opposition within the Israeli political sphere, divided into 2 categories. The first category includes the opposition parties along with the Netanyahu's rivals, including the largest opposition party led by former Prime Minister Lapid, the Secular Centrist Party, and other center-left parties such as the Labour Party, left-wing Marist Party, Arab parties, and the secular right-wing parties. The second category comes from within the ruling coalition, including Netanyahu's Likud group. These people are concerned about the extremist nature of right-wing politicians and feel like Netanyahu has tolerated many extreme behaviors to get support from the far right. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the leader of the Jewish Power Party, Ben-Gvir, who went to the Temple Mount without authorization, previously called for the establishment of National Guard directly under the Ministry of Public Security, independent of the military and police system, which challenged the Israeli military and raised concern among the Israeli public about the potential establishment of a religious police force. Well, I feel like Iran might be thinking, you should have just asked me, and I would like to teach you everything about a religious police for free. On March 25th, Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, from the Likud group, came forward and called for a suspension of the judicial reform, receiving support from several senior politicians. The next day, Netanyahu dismissed the defense minister, leading to large-scale protests across the whole country. Even the usually quiet Israeli president made a real statement, calling on Netanyahu to stop the judicial reform. 2 days later, Netanyahu was forced to back down and suspend the reform. However, the suspension of the judicial reform was not the end. The right-wing justice minister, Eli Shakeh, and public security minister, Ben-Gvir, had previously threatened to withdraw from the ruling coalition if the reform was stopped. To appease his allies, Netanyahu officially approved Ben-Gvir's National Guard on April 2nd, with a force of 1,800 personnel. Since there was no special budget, funds had to be cut from other departments. For the right-wing alliance, this attempt was still considered a gain, although it was far from establishing a religious police force. On April 3rd, the Israeli Prime Minister's office issued a statement postponing the dismissal of defense minister. Netanyahu made compromises to satisfy both sides and maintain his ruling coalition. Now, here's the new question. Since the Israeli people are so opposed to the judicial reform, will they continue to oppose the right-wing group? The answer is no. In fact, the opposition to the judicial reform was primarily directed at Netanyahu's personal corruption and specific policies. From a historical perspective, there has been a clear right-wing shift in Israeli public opinion. This is also the result of Netanyahu's long-term rule over the past decade or so, which also forms the political basis for his challenge to the power of the Supreme Court. Then, let me show you two reasons for the overwhelming right-wing shift in Israel. As a small country with a population of 9 million, especially in the Middle East region, the first reason is external factors. Over the past decades, Israel had benefited greatly from a favorable stance and support from the United States, which has allowed its government to pursue a more hawkish foreign policy without facing huge resistance. In 2001, Ariel Sharon, who triggered a large-scale conflict, replaced Ehud Barak as the prime minister. During his tenure, he implemented several crackdowns on the Palestinians, long-besieged Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, and squeezed the living space of Palestine. In November 2003, Sharon proposed the concept of the unilateral disengagement and prepared to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. The withdrawal was completed in 2005, ending Israel's 38-year occupation of the Gaza Strip. For sure, Sharon's decision was not driven by his goodness or desire for peaceful resolution, but rather his preference for moderate diplomatic strategy that would consolidate Israel's fundamental interests through smaller concessions. However, many right-wing leaders, including Benjamin Netanyahu, disliked Sharon's policy, which finally led to his departure from the Likud party. In 2007, Netanyahu begins his long-term leadership. His first act was to strengthen the suppression of the Palestinians, increase the armed intervention in Gaza Strip, and launch a strategic offensive against the neighboring Arab countries, such as military strikes in Lebanon, interference in Syria's civil war, and attacks of Iranian nuclear facilities. These actions did not face substantial consequence due to the lack of opposition from the United States. In fact, in 2017, the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Therefore, Israel's aggressive foreign policy over the past decade has gained huge rewards. Since 2020, Israel has signed Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, rapidly advancing the normalization of relations with Arab countries. In the eyes of many Israelis, these achievements prove that a tough approach can bring peace and respect from Arab nations. Consequently, many people don't oppose the right-wing foreign policy. The second reason is domestic factors, because of Israel's population structure and religious conflicts. After World War II, a significant source of cohesion for Israel as a nation was Jewish nationalism, also known as Zionism. Although Israel is a secular country and does not have a distinct mono-religious characteristics like its surrounding countries, the Israeli government has been hugely favoring religious Jewish community known as the Haredim. As full-time religious personnel, they are supported by the secular Jews. Based on religious traditions, Haredim men dressed in black and white, grow beards, and have sidekers. Married women shave their heads and wear wigs or head coverings, along with the modest clothes that covers their entire body. Therefore, it's very easy for regular people to identify them on the street. Apart from financial support from the government, Haredi individuals also reject many elements of modern life. They do not agree with Israel being established as a secular state, so they generally don't serve in the military. Their daily routines primarily consist of studying religious books and engaging in worship. Their children receive education in separate religious schools and do not enter the national public education system. In 2020, the Israeli government conducted an investigation into the standards of religious schools. Although these schools teach mathematics, 95% of math teachers have not received formal training in mathematics education, and only 3% of students pass the math requirements. In secondary school, 84% of students do not study English, mathematics, and natural science. Regarding their approach to childbirth, the Haredim follow the teachings of the Bible, which encouraged being fruitful and multiplying. Consequently, they oppose abortion and refuse contraception. On average, each Haredim family have 7 children, with some having as many as 10 to 15. The government financially supports their procreation, including the parents. With their exceptional high birth rates, the Haredim now constitute 10% of the population, with new births nearly 20%. They strongly support right-wing groups, pushing the Israeli political landscape towards the right. While the influence of the religious Jewish group has grown, there is also a huge Muslim population, which now approaches 2 million, as 20% of population. Compared to the Haredim, they prefer a secular way of life. Many of their children go to public schools, and when they grow up, they are willing to serve in the military. As early as 2013, the strongest Israeli army battalion from the Golani Brigade already had Arab individuals serving as the commander. However, Israel is mostly based on Judaism. When we look at their national flag, we see the Star of David. And the national anthem sings about Jerusalem, the holy city for Jews. Therefore, there has always been a rift between the mainstream Jewish people and Muslim citizens. The more Muslim population grows, the more mainstream tends to lean towards the right wing. At the same time, they are also more tolerant of the existence of Haredim and supportive of the right-wing policy. In recent years, there have been multiple conflicts between the Muslims and the Jews within Israel. Right-wing politicians in Israel have made strong statements targeting Arab individuals. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the former Minister of Internal Security, Ben-Gvir, openly stated intention to expel a certain number of so-called Arab terrorists and protect Israeli settlements and the Jewish character. That's also the reason why many people support his idea of building an independent armed security force. Under the combined influence of these factors, in the past decade, regular Israelis have been more inclined to vote for right-wing parties. Traditional left-wing parties, such as the Labour Party that had produced many prime ministers in the past, have been marginalized. In the 2020 parliamentary elections, the Labour Party only won 7 seats, and in recent 2022 elections, they were left with only 4 seats. However, we gotta also note that the main support for these right-wing politicians and the religious leaders still comes from the ordinary Israelis. Those who serve in the military, pay taxes, and cannot fully embrace religious life. They can kind of accept the presence of the Haredim, but don't want them to take away the dominance of secular life. In a controversy sparked by the judicial reform, right-wing politicians argued that the military is not tough enough in foreign affairs and they launch more wars. However, the Haredi faction, which forms the basis of right-wing, does not serve in the military, and it instead leaves the task of going to the battlefield to regular people. At this point, young Israelis cannot accept the extreme right-wing politicians. They express their dislike through the protests and strikes, ultimately forcing Netanyahu to suspend the judicial reform. The unfair obligation to serve in the military challenged many young people and leads them to join the opposition. However, the opposition sentiment of right-wing supporters only lasts until the temporary pause of the judicial reform, without any further actions. I believe they will still support the government's next series of right-leaning policies in the future. Now, let's go back to the initial topic. When Israeli citizens went on the streets to protest against the judicial reform, Netanyahu's son, Yair, falsely claimed that the US State Department was behind a color revolution targeting Israel. Why would he deliberately create the fake news? Firstly, Netanyahu family and the US Democratic Party had a bad relationship. Historically, although the Democrats have supported Israel based on the basic US policies, they tend to prefer moderate Israeli leaders and hope that Israel can maintain its power in the Middle East through strategic policies. For example, Clinton and Obama both want Israel to seriously implement the two-state solution and allow Palestine to establish its own state. During Obama's term, he also sought to improve relations with Iran, which differ from Netanyahu and Israeli right-wing's political direction. In 2015, during Netanyahu's visit to America, he delivered a speech in Congress condemning the nuclear agreement with Iran as a nightmare. Biden was the vice president during the Obama era and was involved in foreign policy decisions of the time. His relationship with Netanyahu is also not good. However, having a strained relationship does not mean that the Biden administration would plan to overthrow Netanyahu or even plan a color revolution. After all, Israel is the most reliable ally of the United States in the Middle East, and over the years, many cases have shown that the US has very limited ability to interfere in Israeli domestic policies. In terms of US interference, in reality, Netanyahu's son cannot prove any evidence. It's just the smoke screen he released. He defines all domestic oppositions as foreign forces and even makes fake news. It's mainly to cover his corruption issues. Many years ago, he was already under investigation by the Israeli judicial system. It started because he lived in the prime minister's residence for an extended period and used state funds based on his position as the prime minister's son. Then, because he quoted an anti-Semitic cartoon to mock Netanyahu's opponents, the media discovered that he actually doesn't care about the feelings of the regular Jewish people. And in 2018, Facebook banned him for his hate speech. On March 2018, the police simultaneously investigated Yair and his father, which almost resulted in Netanyahu's resignation. However, due to the overall right-wing shift in Israeli society and the need for a strong leader, they ultimately avoided legal persecution. Therefore, it's not difficult to understand that Yair has a huge hate on Israel's judicial system and looks forward to weakening its power. However, without a US intervention, the current political situation in Israel is much more complex than we imagine. Due to the conflict between China and the United States and a huge trade interest with China, many Middle Eastern countries have started to actively challenge American influence in diplomatic and economic matters. For example, the diplomatic rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. As the only reliable power for the US in the Middle East, Israel's right-wing shift won't be stopped. Finally, I just want to say maybe some Israeli politicians and groups are making themselves become more like a country they used to hate. Thank you for watching the video, and hopefully subscribe, ring the bell, and leave some comments if you like. See you next time!